The NFL preseason is officially over. The Detroit Lions have gone 2-1. They've gone through training camp, they've gone through the preseason. Every player on the roster bubble has had their opportunity to make their case for the final 53. And now it is officially that time of year where the Detroit Lions have to cut their roster down to 53 players in order to compete for the 2024 season. And today we're going to take a look at that 53-man roster. We're going to take a look at a predictive outlook of what this roster could look like, what positions might have more players stay, what players might have earned that roster spot, and what players may have lost their roster spots that a couple of months or even just a couple of weeks ago seemed like they were going to be locks for their position. So today we're going to take a look at that as well as the 16-man practice squad, get a full look of what this team might potentially look like, and then, of course, talk about the regular season. Now, starting off at quarterback, this one is pretty easy. Jared Goff will be the starting quarterback, and Hendon Hooker will be quarterback too. Hendon Hooker started and played a majority of the game in week 3 of the NFL preseason, and despite Nate Sudfeld starting and playing 2 halves for the Detroit Lions against the Giants and the Chiefs, I do think that Hendon Hooker is not only the future, but I do think he is the primary backup quarterback to this point. I thought throughout the entirety of the preseason, Hendon Hooker was far more impressive than Nate Sudfeld was. Of course, against the Steelers' first team defense, yeah, he had some struggles. Yeah, he took a couple of sacks. Yeah, he held onto the ball a little bit too long. But I also think that if you give Hendon Hooker the starting offensive line that the Detroit Lions have, you give Hendon Hooker the running game that the Detroit Lions have, you give him the wide receivers like Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sam Laporta, and Jameson Williams, like he would have if he were to be put in as the starter in case Jared Goff gets hurt, I think you'd see a much more prolific, I think you'd see a much better quarterback in what Hendon Hooker already showed. And even in the preseason, I thought he was really solid. His first preseason game, he was 5 of 9, I believe, for 40 passing yards and about 50 rushing yards. His second game, he went 12 for 15, over 100 passing yards and a rushing touchdown. And even last week, when he went 12 for 20 for over 100 passing yards and a pick, he still had a touchdown through the air as well as almost 100 rushing yards on the ground. He brings a dynamic element to this quarterback room that we haven't seen in a very, very long time. And I do think he is not only more talented, but I think more suited for this offense than Nate Sudfeld. If it was between Nate Sudfeld and Hendon Hooker to win us a couple of games in the absence of Jared Goff, I would want Hendon Hooker far before I would take Nate Sudfeld. However, with that being said, I do think Sudfeld makes the practice squad. I think he's one of those veteran players that is allowed on the practice squad because in reality, the Lions might want Nate Sudfeld over Hendon Hooker in a one-game scenario, a player with some starting NFL experience, a player that has played in a real NFL regular season game. And even though he's not the most talented, even though he's not really a great backup quarterback option, that experience is vital for a lot of quarterbacks, living up to the moment, stepping up in big situations. And Nate Sudfeld has the experience doing that more so than Hendon Hooker. But obviously, you can't put Hendon Hooker on the practice squad, and I don't think very many teams are going to take a stab at Nate Sudfeld. At running back, I do think the Lions only keep 3 running backs. With the depth of cornerback, defensive line, and offensive line, the Lions have to cut and trim some of the fat at other skill positions. And I do think that the running back position is one of those areas. Jahmyr Gibbs is, of course, going to make the roster. Former first-round pick, one of the best rookie running backs, if not one of the best running backs in all of football last year. He will, of course, make the roster as he recovers from a hamstring injury. David Montgomery, the engine to this offense early on in the season, will make this roster, of course. And then 4th-round selection, Sione Vaki, the running back from Utah, one of the preseason standouts for this team, will, of course, make the roster. A top 150 pick is not going to make it to the practice squad if cut, so he will make the roster. I think will be a really solid upgrade at running back 3. Craig Reynolds last year took about 42 carries and really wasn't all that efficient. He was good in the run blocking game. He was good as a pass blocking running back, a blitz pickup guy, but as a rusher, he really wasn't that efficient. As a receiving back, he was okay, but again, really wasn't that efficient. So while you might be downgrading slightly from a pass protection standpoint from your running back 3, you're upgrading in a lot of other areas as a playmaker, as a rusher, as a receiver, as a yards after catch threat, as a weapon that Jared Goff can use to move the offense down the field. I think Sione Vaki outclasses Craig Reynolds in just about every area. And truthfully, I don't think Craig Reynolds is going to have that large of a market. Well, I love what he's done for the Detroit Lions. I think he is the epitome of what they want in a football player. The reality is that Craig Reynolds has never put up great numbers. The reality is a lot of teams probably don't even know who Craig Reynolds is other than the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And the reality is that Craig Reynolds will probably make it to a practice squad spot because despite being really good at pass blocking and picking up the blitz, as I said, that skill only takes you so far when you're averaging less than 3 yards a carry on your career. And when last year, you really weren't that efficient on the ground or through the air. Blitz pickup can be awesome for a player to make the roster, but if that's the only skill you bring, really isn't going to be very helpful. Now, I do think the Lions go pretty deep in the practice squad with their running backs. I think they keep Jamar Jefferson and Zonovan Knight. Of course, Jamar Jefferson having the 2-touchdown game pretty early or pretty late in the preseason against the Steelers. He had a pretty good game there in week 3. And then Zonovan Knight, a player that got just 3 carries for the Lions last year before going down with the season-ending injury. He's a player that the Lions like. They put on the practice squad. They brought him back for the preseason. He's clearly a player that the Detroit Lions like to have around. So I do think with the room on the practice squad, they could potentially keep up to 3 running backs and call up maybe each and every one of them at some point throughout the season, especially if injuries do arise. I don't think any of these 3 guys are really at threat of being taken away from the practice squad after being waived. But if they do, I think that all 3 of them, the Lions could live without. Going over to the wide receivers. I think wide receiver is pretty thin this year as well. The Lions went in with 6 wide receivers last year, as well as in 2022 and 2021. I think this year they take 5. Again, with the depth at defensive line, with the depth at offensive line and cornerback and some of these other positions, you're going to have to trim the fat a little bit. And considering the fact that the Lions wide receiver 5 last year had just 10 targets and their wide receiver 6 had just 7 targets, I think they can live with just a couple of wide receivers. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams, and Khalif Raymond will, of course, make this roster. Those are the 3 locks that I think nobody will argue with for this team. I think Daurice Fountain does make this roster, a 6'2" field stretcher. A 6'2" field stretcher, a player that throughout camp was taking reps with the first team offense, got more comfortable with Jared Goff, with Ben Johnson's play calling, was able to create that separation and able to play very well. And despite the very disappointing preseason, it's going to happen when backup quarterbacks are throwing to you. When you're splitting reps with the first team, and you're only getting about half of your opportunities with the backups in practice, of course that chemistry is going to be a little bit off. Of course, your opportunities aren't going to seem as good with the backups as they will with the starters, but I do think Daurice Fountain makes this roster. He was impressive enough throughout training camp. Through the clips we've seen at training camp, he was creating separation. He was giving the Lions that downfield X wide receiver threat, and even though he might not put up monster numbers, I do think we could probably see Daurice Fountain put up 400 to 500 yards, 2 to 3 touchdowns, while Jameson Williams, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Khalif Raymond, Sam Laporta all have really good seasons in their own right. And again, even though he is technically the 4th wide receiver, even though he'd probably be starting at that X position more times than not, he's going to be the 5th, if not the 6th receiving option on this offense in terms of targets and receptions. And all he really has to do is be the big body field stretcher, make 1 or 2 catches a game, and I think his role will seem pretty filled. Now, I think Isaiah Williams makes this roster as the wide receiver 5. The most impressive offensive player throughout the preseason, in my opinion. Super shifty, good hands, great route running. And I think the moment that really solidified him over Donovan Peoples-Jones for me was in the final preseason game, where not only did Isaiah Williams know the play, he knew where he was supposed to be, he knew every route that was supposed to go on, he knew the entirety of the play, he was directing Donovan Peoples-Jones to his spot and telling him where to go in the pre-snap process. He understands this offense really well. He's worked super hard. There are clips of him and Khalif Raymond after practice doing exactly what St. Brown does, catching passes, getting reps on the jugs machine. He has strong hands. He's really shifty after the catch. Reminds me a little bit of that Amon-Ra St. Brown, that Golden Tate-esque player. And I think the Lions would be good and right to keep him, especially considering how much of a standout he was in the preseason. Now, again, I think just like running back, the Lions will go a little heavy on the practice squad wide receivers. Jalen Calhoun, I thought, had a pretty nice preseason game against the Steelers. Maurice Alexander, I think, is their backup secondary option for punt and kick returner, so you're going to keep that on the roster and on the practice squad just like last year. And I think Caden Davis, after his big play versus the Chiefs and a couple of strong reps versus the Steelers, I think he has a case to make the practice squad as well. He is a veteran player that's been a journeyman around a lot of practice squads in the NFL, and I think he finds another home and another spot to stick with the Detroit Lions, who, again, might not make the active roster, might not be at every single game, but I think in terms of if there is a major injury to Khalif Raymond, if there's a major injury to Isaiah Williams, they have those roles prepared and filled because of the depth they have on the practice squad. Now, you might be asking, well, where is Donovan Peoples-Jones? Personally, I don't think Donovan Peoples-Jones makes this roster. I think he gets waived, and I think some other team is going to be willing to take the risk, right? He's still 6'2". He still has some decent speed. He still has some contested catch ability. He still is a player that just 2 seasons ago put up over 800 receiving yards. There is some talent there with Donovan Peoples-Jones, but I think especially after the poor training camp, especially after the poor preseason, I think the Lions are going to go with the guys that have stood out in their camp, in their preseason, and I don't think they're afraid to let go of a guy that even after being traded for just doesn't quite have what it takes to make the roster. On the offensive, actually, let's start off with the tight ends. I think the Lions go pretty heavy at tight ends here. I think they keep Sam Laporta, Brock Wright, James Mitchell, and Shane Zylstra. Now, before Sam Laporta was drafted, the Lions fandom was looking at this tight end room and saying they don't need a tight end very high. Brock Wright was a decent enough option. James Mitchell had a high enough ceiling, and Shane Zylstra showed enough flashes to say, hey, they could probably work with that. Will they have a top tight end room in the NFL? Probably not, but they will have a serviceable one. Then you add in Sam Laporta, and of course, after Ben Johnson's comments, many believe that this is the highest graded and one of the best tight end rooms, not only in the NFL, but that Ben Johnson has ever worked with. Sam Laporta is, of course, the top 4 tight end in the NFL. Great receiving option, great blocking option, the next great Iowa tight end. Brock Wright is a very good run blocker. He is a very good guy. He's kind of Jared Goff's security blanket at the end of the day, which on an offense with Amon-Ra St. Brown and Sam Laporta might seem weird. But if you're in a 4th-and-1 situation, weirdly enough, the Detroit Lions go to Brock Wright just about as much as anybody else. Of course, St. Brown is usually the first look, but if not, they usually go to Brock Wright in those 4th-and-1 situations to leak out of the back of kind of that play. And more times than not, he ends up making the big play and being that security blanket. James Mitchell's quietly played in 15 games for the Detroit Lions last year, made some time at fullback, had some time at tight end, was kind of a versatile weapon. And again, I think is a good enough athlete and field stretcher that you're not going to want to get rid of him. And although Shane Zylstra has not had a great NFL career, in fact, throughout 2 seasons of his NFL career, he doesn't even have 100 receiving yards. I do think he does stretch the field enough. I do think he is a good enough receiver to keep around. And I think he's a guy that, especially after the injury he suffered last year, is looking to get back on the field, and the Lions will keep. I think Parker Hesse will end up making the practice squad, a player that had a couple nice reps throughout the preseason, a player that was really, really solid. But again, you're not going to keep 5 tight ends on the roster. It just isn't very feasible. And I do think they will be able to sneak Hesse onto the practice squad overall. Now getting to the offensive line, I think they carry a lot of offensive line this year. And despite the troubles that the offensive line had in the preseason, I actually think their depth is pretty solid. Taylor Decker will start at left tackle, Graham Glasgow at left guard, Frank Ragnow at center, Kevin Zeitler at right guard, and Penei Sewell at right tackle. Dan Skipper will make this roster as the 6th offensive lineman, officially being a tackle, but of course we know he is, lines up at tight end sometimes. He lines up as the 6th offensive line. He kind of is that extra guy. Giovanni Manu, of course, being the 4th-round selection, will make the roster as well as offensive tackle. I thought he had a couple of really good reps, especially versus the Steelers. Colby Sorsdale, the 5th-round selection from 2 seasons ago, will make this roster as an offensive guard / offensive tackle. I think Coyote Owasaka will make this roster. He started in the NFC Championship game a year ago. He's been in the big moments. He's made the big plays. And honestly, when he started last year, I thought he was pretty good overall, especially in that NFC Championship game, stepping up in the absence of Jonah Jackson. I think Kingsley Eguakun will actually make this roster at center. Dan Campbell, especially over the last couple of days, has said a lot of positive things about Eguakun, just how he's very polished for a player of his age, how he is making really good plays for this team. being the center that they need him to be in the preseason. And I do think they will keep him as a potential depth option for Frank Ragnow, and especially for the future. And I think Duke Clemens will make the practice squad, a player coming out of UCLA that graded out as a top 3 center in both run blocking and pass blocking in college football a season ago. I thought he was really good at right guard throughout the season. Obviously, Egu Khan got the start at center, which means Clemens was kicked out to right guard. I thought he played okay. Thought he had some good moments and some bad moments, but a player that I do believe they want to keep around. Did have a signing bonus as an undrafted free agent, and I do think the Lions will keep for the long term. Getting over to the defensive side of the ball, I think the defensive line is going to be pretty deep this year and much improved from a season ago. Aleem McNeil and DJ Reader are, of course, the big names up front, but Levi Onwuzurike has reportedly been one of the best players throughout training camp with some edge versatility. There's no way he doesn't make the roster. Broderick Martin, the third-round selection from 2 years ago, has made massive strides forward and will make the roster. I think Kyle Pico, who's been taking first-team reps with the Detroit Lions defensive line throughout camp, will also make the roster as that veteran presence alongside Aleem McNeil and DJ Reader. And then, of course, Mekhi Wingo, the pass rushing specialist from the interior, had a really good preseason, had a really good camp, got quite a few pressures, and I believe even contributed to a sack, and I believe he will make the roster as well. On the edge, I think the Lions go a little light at edge this year. Last year, they kept 6, if not 7 players on the edge rushers. This year, I think they keep just 5. With the versatility that Levi Onwuzurike brings to your team, I do think that if he can stay healthy, he can kind of sub in as that 6th edge rusher, meaning you really have 6 defensive line and 6 edge rushers. Aiden Hutchinson, as well as Marcus Davenport, will be your starting edge rusher, with Josh Paschal getting a healthy rotation as well. And despite what a lot of people think, I don't believe the Lions are ready to get rid of James Houston. They re-signed him to a 2-year extension in this offseason. I think they know what they have in James Houston. They know they have the pass rushing specialist. And even if he's not a 3-down player, even if he does have a limited role, the role that he plays on this defense as a pass rusher, his ability to win one-on-one versus a tackle or a guard is second to none on this team. I think he has the best bend. I think he has some of the best burst on this team. And if you're talking pure pass rushers, he is easily top 2 on this team, and honestly, he might not even be 2. And then, of course, Isaac Ukwu, who walked away with 3 sacks and a forced fumble this preseason, was super impressive. Very, very good for the Lions defensive line. He might not see very much time, might not see very many reps, but I do think he is very much worthy of the roster spot, as he is the 3rd, I believe, UDFA to make the roster this offseason. Moving on to the linebackers, this one's pretty easy. I think these 5 linebackers have been locked in from the beginning, and nothing throughout the preseason has changed my mind. Jack Campbell, Alex Anzalone, Derek Barnes, Malcolm Rodriguez, and Jalen Reeves-Maybin will all make this roster. The Lions typically play with 2-3 linebackers at the most at a time. These 5 guys all fill a role. Jack Campbell is kind of a big run stopper. Alex Anzalone is kind of the pass coverage guy. Derek Barnes is the in-betweener who can play some pass rush, who can blitz, get after the quarterback. Jalen Reeves-Maybin is the blitz specialist and is really quick off the jump. And, of course, Malcolm Rodriguez is a really good run stuffer in the depth parts of this linebacking core. Won't see as much time, but is a player that even as early as last season in the playoffs was making a big impact in the absence of Derek Barnes. The cornerback room, I think, is a little bit, not necessarily light, but I think not as deep as we once thought it would be. Carlton Davis will be cornerback 1. Terrion Arnold will be cornerback 2. Ennis Rakestraw will be cornerback 3. Amik Robertson, I think, will start in the slot for the Detroit Lions, with Kendall Vilder, I think, rightfully making this roster, as well as Khalil Dorsey. Now, this doesn't look nearly as good as it did at the start of training camp when we had guys like Emmanuel Mosley on this roster as well, who would potentially be cornerback 5. But I do think that this is a good cornerback room overall. Carlton Davis has experience being the number 1 cornerback on a Super Bowl caliber defense. Terrion Arnold, the top 25 pick, a player that the Lions have a lot of excitement for and looked great in his first preseason game. Ennis Rakestraw, arguably the most impressive secondary player from all of training camp, who played great as well against the New York Giants. Amik Robertson, the free agent acquisition, who the Lions are very excited to have in the slot. I think him and Brian Branch will split some time there. Kendall Vilder, a starting cornerback from a season ago, is now cornerback 4. Not a player you want to rely on in your secondary, but if you, for whatever reason, are down 4 starting cornerbacks, you could do a lot worse than Kendall Vilder. And then, of course, Khalil Dorsey, with that special teams contributions, I think narrowly edges out this roster over a guy like Stephen Gilmore. At the safety position, I think they go with 4, and the 4 easy options are Brian Branch, Kirby Joseph, Ifeatu Melifonwu, and Brandon Joseph. Brian Branch, Kirby, and Melifonwu are locks for this roster, and I think Brandon Joseph has earned that spot. A forced fumble and an interception throughout the preseason. Definitely has to work on his tackling a little bit, but is a ball-hawking safety, takes the football away, makes some big plays, and was even taking reps with the first-team defense throughout training camp. This is a player the Lions really wanted to get on the field last year and weren't quite able to do so. I think Brandon Joseph is pretty safe on this roster and is one of the newest members to officially make his Lions regular season debut. Now, taking a look overall, the special team is going to be Fox, Bates, and Daly. Pretty easy, pretty cookie cutter right there. And then the overall practice squad, I think, is pretty solid. So you're going to have Nate Sudfeld at quarterback, a player that has that NFL experience, has the ability to step in if needed. You're not going to call up your third-string quarterback more than 4 games. And if you do, it's going to be because Jared Goff has a season-ending injury. If Hendon Hooker has to step in for a quarter, I think the Lions are comfortable with that. If it has to be a whole game and the Lions feel more comfortable with Sudfeld, they'll pull him up for a game or 2. He has up to 4, but you'll never need Sudfeld for more than that. I think the Lions go pretty heavy with the skill positions on their practice squad. Jalen Calhoun, Maurice Alexander, and Caden Davis, we've already talked about. Parker Hesse, we've already talked about. Jamar Jefferson, we've talked about at running back, as well as Zonovan Knight. And then, of course, Craig Reynolds there at the bottom. I think Duke Clemens makes this roster as an offensive guard on the practice squad. I think Mitchell Agude as well as Matthew Betts will both make the practice squad as edge rushers. Again, not great run defenders, pretty quick, twitchy pass rushers. I think Ukwu and Houston were more impressive throughout the preseason than Agude and Betts, but again, there is some room to wiggle there, and if you don't think James Houston makes it, some people think Agude and Betts had the better preseason and deserve that spot a little bit more. Benjamin Neiman, I think, will be the 6th linebacker on this roster on the practice squad. Could be potentially called up if there are injuries, but overall, I don't think that's super necessary. The linebacker 6 last year was Anthony Pittman. He was a good special teams contributor, but never saw an action or a rep of regular season defense. Stephen Gilmore, a player that did make the roster last year, I don't think makes it this year, gets narrowly edged out because of that special teams contributions. I think Lauren Strickland, the undrafted rookie free agent from Ball State, will make the roster. I thought he was very impressive throughout the preseason as a slot defender and a safety. And then Ty Summers, the linebacker, who had a sack and a half, as well as I think 5 tackles in his last preseason game versus Pittsburgh, was very impressive as well. I think he will make the practice squad. That does leave one player, the 16th member of that practice squad, up in the air. After roster cuts are cut down, the Lions might want to add another big body wide receiver. They might want to add another cornerback. They might want to add another player at a certain position. It'd be very interesting to see what happens there, but I don't think the entirety of the practice squad is on the Lions roster at this very moment. A couple of other players that I think are worthy of mention on the NFI list. You, of course, have Christian Mahogany, who will not start the season, but potentially will rejoin the roster, maybe booting Kingsley Egukan to the practice squad after that does happen. And then, of course, on IR, you have John Kaminsky, Emmanuel Mosley, Connor Galvin, Antoine Green, as well as Michael Badgley, players that were I think supposed to be pretty impactful. Kaminsky, Mosley, even Badgley were all supposed to be starters this year and will no longer play. Mosley's the only one that could potentially come back this year with a torn pectoral, but if he does, it will be far closer to the playoffs, if not already within the playoff process. So, with all that being said, that is my official pick for the 53-man roster, from quarterback to kicker, offense and defense to special teams. Those are my 53 players that I think will take the Detroit Lions to a deep playoff run and potentially a Super Bowl run. They have a great quarterback. They have great running back depth. They have great offensive line depth. They go a little deep. They go a little shallow, I should say, at wide receiver and running back, but the skill positions are there. The tight end group is phenomenal. The offensive line is phenomenal. The defensive line is super, super deep. And I think the cornerbacks are much upgraded. Everything is pointing to the Detroit Lions having a great season this year, and I do think this is the roster to officially get it done. But with all of that being said, that is all I have for you guys today. Thank you all so very much for watching this video, going through the 53-man roster with me. If you have any changes that you would make to the roster in an ideal world, please let me know down in the comments below. Do you think that James Houston doesn't make this roster? Do you think that Brandon Joseph doesn't make this roster? Isaiah Williams? Or do you think DPJ does make the roster? I'd be very curious what you guys have to say and what you guys think. Let me know your roster predictions down in the comments below. But with all of that being said, that is all I have for you guys today. Please go down below and subscribe to the channel. Helps the channel out a ton. And we're shooting for 4,200 subscribers by the time the Lions kick off on Sunday Night Football. But with all that being said, that is all I have for you guys right now. Thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, and as always, go Lions.